Well, good evening. Yeah, thanks for that, Tyler. That's really easy to follow. Choked up myself for a second. But we will be continuing in Ephesians chapter 6, where we left off last week. For those of you who were not here last week or need a little bit of a refresher, we began chapter 6 in earnest last class as we focused on, again, this sort of idea that we see seated at the end of chapter 5 and the comparison of marriage, and then further on into the first half of chapter 6, the family unit and its comparisons to Christ as the head of the church, and how we can better understand Christ's relationship to the body, to the church, through understanding it through the family unit. But what is the common theme? And we saw this last week and we talked about this a lot. The common theme of husbands to wives, wives to husbands, children to their parents, slaves to their masters is what? In one word, what really is, well, there's really two answers for this, but in one word, what would be the common theme of all of those relationships as Paul goes through them for us? Janine?
Two words, love and obedience.
Love and obedience. I think those are two very good words. We see obedience, we see love echoed from chapter 4 onwards, and you could use the word subjection. Either obedience or subjection, both of those fit very well into this common theme, as well as being girded in love, and following in the example of Christ's love, as I'm sure Janine is referencing. The idea for all of us is to understand that, and I know we've repeated this a lot, but it bears remembering that the earthly authorities which we find ourselves in subjection to, whether they be husbands and wives, the children to their parents, or slaves to their masters, we are all in subjection to some earthly authority. And obeying those authorities and willingly subjecting ourselves to that authority makes it possible for us to do it towards Christ. Because if we cannot obey the authorities that are tangible, that we can experience with our five senses, it's that much harder to do it towards God and to Christ, that we cannot experience with our five senses in the same way, because God is not a physical being. And neither, well, at this time, neither is Christ. And so we spent a good time about that. We talked about honor. We had some good discussion on, honoring one's father and mother and what that looked like. And so tonight we're going to get into probably the most famous part of Ephesians chapter 6, which is beginning, though I don't know how far we will actually talk about the armor of God, but we're going to transition, and in my opinion, this is where chapter 6 should actually start, in verse 10, as we will see Paul transition into talking to his closing words. Now, to set this up thematically, we have been spending from chapter 4 onwards talking about how we, as followers of Christ and followers of God, are to conduct ourselves in the world with the foundational principle of love towards one another, love towards our neighbor, and showing honor and respect and being in subjection to authorities, and putting on the new self. The last part that Paul is going to end on in this chapter is an encouragement to be strong against the forces that will keep us from accomplishing all the things that he has set up in chapters 4, 5, and 6 before this. And that's what we will speak on this evening. I don't know how far we'll get, but I imagine we're not going to get too far past verse 14. So, to that end, let's see. Nolan, Papillon, would you mind reading verses 10 through... we'll go ahead and do 10 through 18.
Finally, be strong in the Lord and his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God, so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not breastplate of righteousness in place, and with your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. In addition to all this, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, and pray in the Spirit on all occasions, with all kinds of prayers and requests. With this in mind, be alert and always keep on praying for all the saints.
That's good. Thank you. Okay. So, again, very ambitious that we're going to get through verse 18. But I want us to focus on our attention in verses 10 through 13 as we set up this idea of the armor of God. Paul starts by saying, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. And this is something, I think this verse gets overlooked a lot from the pulpit because we all want to jump, and I say we, preachers and teachers, really want to jump in. Let's get into verse 11. But verse 10 is a prerequisite that sometimes we forget. Be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. How do we, putting in our own words, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might? What would that look like for ourselves? Trusting him. Putting our trust, or one could say our faith, in God and in the strength of his might. Why is that important? Oh, I thought I saw a hand up. Never mind. So you won't waver? Right, because we are going to face some struggles, obviously, as we talked about both this morning and over the last several weeks. We are going to face struggles. And we are going to need to rely upon the Lord because, and this is, I think many of us know the answer to this, but it still bears asking this question, which is, are we going to be able to overcome all of our trials, especially our spiritual trials, on this earth on our own? No. We have to rely upon the strength of the Lord and in God because it's an acknowledgement that we are not going to be able to do everything on our own. We're not going to be able to overcome every scheme of the devil, and as we'll see in a few moments, every scheme of whatever forces of evil are out there. We don't have the strength in and of ourselves. If we did, God would say it. God would say, rely upon your own might, and you'll be able to overcome and have the strength of will. It doesn't say that. It says, be strong in the Lord and the strength of his might, because those are necessary to put on the armor. If, like Tyler said, if we don't trust in the strength of God, then how can we trust in the defenses that God provides? This is why it's necessary. If we don't think in and of ourselves that we need God's assistance, that we need his armor, or the armor that he provides, then we're not going to ever go to it. We're not going to put it on. We're not going to rely upon the Lord. Janine?
This is a picture of a Christian soldier and his equipment.
Yes. Yes, it is. It's a picture of a Christian soldier and his equipment, and as we'll see, we'll get into that. But this is the starting of what we must do. First, we must rely upon the Lord and in his strength, and to recognize that, and then we can put on the armor as we see in verse 11, so that you will be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. It's not our armor. It's not armor that we made ourselves, but it is the armor of God. And it's in provision. I'm reminded of Psalm 46, where it talks about, do not fear when the mountains roar and or the mountains fall into the ocean and the ground roars, which, given what happened last week with the little earthquakes and everything, very reticent for us in California. We see the ground shake a lot. It's like an Etch-a-Sketch out here. And we recognize and understand, firestorms, the ground shaking, mountains falling into the ocean. And then it says in Psalm 46, take refuge in the city of the Lord, for he is our stronghold and our strength. We're seeing much the same idea here in Ephesians chapter 6. God is our protector in that we use his implements to protect ourselves from the schemes of the devil. And then we get to the very famous verse in verse 12. Our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Now, there have been countless tomes, commentaries, opinions, articles written on what are the powers that Paul's talking about here, the world forces, the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. And while we do have some time to think about this for a few moments, I would encourage you not to go too far into the implications of, what does this mean? Is this talking about some hierarchy in the spiritual realms of places that are, other universes, dimensions? We can easily take this too far. The point that I want us to think about is this idea of our struggle. The struggle that we often face, that is the hardest to overcome, is not necessarily physical. Now, it's not to say that there aren't very difficult physical struggles. If you, detach both of your quads from your kneecaps, it's going to be very hard to walk. That's hard. If you have to have a full knee replacement, that's hard. If your body is broken, that's a difficult physical struggle. If, we think about finances, we think about all the things that can make a physical living very difficult. But those things, I think most of us, especially those that, let's say, have lived longer than I have, that's a lot of you, by the way, I'm not that old, that you can understand that a lot of those things are ups and downs, ebbs and flows in the cycle of life. In my limited experience, in my opinion, the much harder things to deal with is not the physical battle. It's the internal spiritual battle. And Paul uses this, and I know, those of you that can remember over a year ago to the gospel meeting, we really focused on this idea of being a spiritual soldier and talking about the armor of God and fighting in a spiritual warfare. That is such good language, in my opinion, because I think sometimes it's very easy for us and for people in the world to say, okay, it's a spiritual struggle. I don't see it, I don't feel it, I don't taste it, touch it, like we said earlier, experience it with our five senses. So it can be something that we don't think about as often. And maybe the stakes aren't as high because it's like, well, I have a whole life to live, and, I deal with these, temptations, but they're not as real as, say, just to throw out a silly example, my car, it's going to take $3,000 to get my car running right. That feels much more tangible than a spiritual battle, a spiritual struggle. And so Paul uses this language, in my opinion, of a battle and a fight to present and to remind us in our heads the stakes. Because the stakes are much more important, obviously, for many of us, we understand this, because these are eternal stakes. And we don't think, and when I say we, I mean human beings as a whole, we're not programmed to think in these sorts of terms because we're physical beings. We have to train ourselves to speak in spiritual terms. So Paul's using this language of battle to get us to understand that this isn't just, I struggled, with anger a little bit, or, I could be more patient, I could be happier. No, these temptations, these struggles, these spiritual hardships are a fight. They are a battle. They are a struggle. And the stakes of which are our immortal souls. And that which we are fighting are the personifications of evil and wickedness and darkness. And that's what we're contending against. And to put in another way as well, in James chapter 1, as it tells us, we're struggling against ourselves. Because the source of all temptation is when I conceive sin through my actions, as I am tempted and driven away by my own lusts and desires. So, what I want us to think about, what I want to ask is, when we think about this idea of a spiritual struggle against, not against the flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of darkness, is less of what are those forces of darkness, though some of you may want to, that may be something interesting to think about, but rather to focus on what that really means to us. When you read this verse, what is a reaction that we are to have in understanding this information? Because remember, this is information put in this way is new for the Ephesian Christians. This is something Paul is putting this to them, and they may have not heard this idea before. So think of it yourself. How would you react? What would you be thinking if you're reading this, and it's the first time that you're really understanding this concept? Nolan?
Would that in part be fighting the influences of this world?
I think 100%, yes. Because we look at the rulers, the powers against the world forces of this darkness. Those are the things that have influence over us in the world. The things that we see and experience and tug on us each and every day that don't have really a physical effect on us, but an internal effect. That's a good point. Anyone else? Oh, I saw a hand. So think of it this way. Why put it in this language? Why talk about the spiritual forces? What is Paul trying to inspire into us with these verses? Ian, do you have your hand up?
The idea of a spirit having any sort of direct influence on us is, frankly, sometimes difficult to wrap our minds around or even agree with. And I've run into, I don't know how many Christians, especially of a certain slant within Christianity, that would probably have a hard time agreeing with the idea of the Spirit indwelling us, like the Holy Spirit indwelling us.
Right.
That being said, kind of difficult for people today to understand this. I really believe that Paul is making it clear, look, we are in a spiritual battle. You are essentially the prize that is being sought after. You have the forces of good, if you will, the Lord and all of his angels, or however you want to describe them. And you have these spiritual forces of evil. They're competing against each other, but you are also caught in the crossfire of that. You can choose this day who you will serve, right?
Yep.
And he was not for us, or I'm sorry, he was not against us with us, and go on with different references. But the idea that, I guess maybe this is sort of like a vague general term, or he's speaking allegorically, like I firmly believe that he is talking about actual spirits that are trying to influence us in many different ways. That's why he talks about in 1 Timothy chapter 4, the doctrine of demons.
Mm-hmm.
It's the idea that there are spiritual forces who will influence us in ways directly or indirectly. How do we combat that? We combat it through this symbolic language that he provides. That I'm sure you're going to talk more about what those mean.
Right. Well, and
We see all through Acts, demons
Mhm.
turning to the Lord, and they were rebuked by the apostles on these occasions. I firmly believe that this is what's at stake, and he's trying to inform them. You can go back to your old ways if you want to, but that's what you're going for. If you
Right.
want to stay away from it, this is how you do that.
Yeah, and to not go too far into, I think there's a lot of places that can rabbit hole us, and I'm not, criticizing you, Ian. You do bring up a couple of good points I think are worth talking about, and I did want to get into this just briefly, without going into the implications with the Holy Spirit, because frankly that's a whole nother 10-week class, is to think about this as Ian said. There are things that have influence. There are things that have influence in this world. Now, we can think of, Paul uses the word spirit. There's an understanding of sort of the spirit that we don't necessarily have in our Western culture. There's also some things to consider as far as, time in the first century, now, some differences in context, especially, keeping 1 Corinthians 14 in mind. But I do think that there is something that I want to dwell on there, Ian, is the fact that there are things that are going to have influence over us. And that's what we are combating against, is those influences. Whether or not, how we want to label those things, we can have debates, we can have discussions, but I don't think reading this verse one can discount and fully say that there are not things beyond ourselves and beyond the physical world that have an influence and a pull on our souls and on us. And again, the names and how we want to label that are, again, up for debate, but I do think that we are doing ourselves a disservice in saying, oh, well, there's nothing out there that's really going to influence me, because at the end of the day, we know that Satan is influencing us and that he's influencing the world. And whether or not there are other forces at play, Paul seems to indicate there are, but at the end of the day, there's really, as you said, Ian, two sides. You have light and you have dark. You have good and you have evil. And that's the two forces that are constantly at play with us, and it is a war. There is a war that is going on that we cannot see between forces of good and evil, whatever forms they metastasize in. And then we are in the middle feeling the influence of both of those forces. And we'll get more into that idea of influence in a second. Janine?
This spiritual darkness and wickedness, we are seeing it every single day. The influence of our children.
Yep.
The influence of, you see the polling on how few people even believe there's a God.
Yep.
Every single day, the fight over abortion now, and every single day we're being pounded with all of this.
Right. There, as you said, Janine, there are influences, there are spiritual forces at play that are influencing us spiritually in the world each and every day that we have to butt up against, and that we're being tempted by, that we're having to struggle against each and every day. And they take many forms. And it's important to understand that it is a fight. Because, and some of you can probably speak more to this than me. If you go into, let's say, a combat scenario, and you are unprepared for the fact that you're going into a dangerous situation, how likely are you to be able to overcome that situation if you're not prepared? Nolan?
You would be less likely because of those types of situations. Sometimes your adrenaline takes over, and you have the power within you to either escalate or de-escalate a situation.
Mm-hmm. And if you're not prepared for the type of situation you're going into, there's less of a likelihood to be able to handle it correctly.
Or you could do more harm than good.
Or you could do more harm than good. Carrie?
We are immediately at a disadvantage, because in our realm, we have no sense of the spiritual,
Mm-hmm.
which is the realm of the prince of the power of air, that Paul calls it,
Exactly.
The problem is, we know nothing about that realm except what God, i.e. Paul, tells us, whereas that realm, because it is the superior realm, knows everything about us.
Ex-
That's why we need the weapons, because we have to find out that we're at such a disadvantage without them.
Exactly. As Carrie just said, we are at a disadvantage because we are fighting a fight that we're not necessarily equipped to understand, because we're fighting something that we don't understand. We don't understand spiritual things, as we said earlier, as Ian pointed out, innately within ourselves. It's just not how we as humans function, and so we're in this fight at a disadvantage. And Carrie didn't quite say this, but I know that's, but to extend his point out further, which is the difference is preparation. The difference is knowing that we are going into a fight, knowing that we are in danger, knowing that we need to equip ourselves. And as Carrie pointed out, that knowledge only comes from the Scripture. If Paul had not written these words that he writes in Ephesians, well, God speaking through Paul, but I think we all understand the semantics there. God had not given us these words through Paul, we would not be prepared against a foe that we innately do not understand, in a battlefield that we are ill-equipped to fight because we're not spiritual beings. We're physical beings. And the point that I wanted to get to is that in order to be in a fight, one thing that really is pivotal in the difference between overcoming the foe or going away in defeat is knowledge and preparation to go into that fight. Christina, did you have your hand up?
So back in Genesis, we're told after the garden scenario, basically everything that the devil or the evil is going to use to get us. And it hasn't changed so many thousands of years later. It's still the same three things.
Yep.
He's after to pleasure, he's after material possessions, and a desire to be significant. So if you look at those three things, he's always coming after us that way.
Yep.
And we were told that, if you're just going to pick up this book and read from beginning to end, you're told that within the first 4 chapters.
100%. That's a great point. In Genesis 3, Eve is tempted by the same 3 basic things that we're all tempted by, and we see that as well echoed in 1 John chapter 3, where John talks about the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the boastful pride of life. Eve was tempted by the fact that the fruit looked good, it was good for food, and it was going to make her wise. Those are the same temptations, as Christine pointed out, that we face each and every day. They just sort of shift in permutation, but it's the same basic way that the devil has always attacked us. And that's consistent throughout Scripture. If you go to Jesus' temptations, what was he tempted by? He was tempted by food. He was tempted by the desire to keep on living, and ultimately the pride of all of this could be yours. Those same temptations that Eve fell to, Jesus is tempted with, and it's always the same things. It's a very good point, Christine, showing that consistency. Lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, and boastful pride of life. It's always there in some form or fashion. And understanding this is what helps us prepare to guard against those things. We don't have to fight in ignorance and fight a fight that we are unprepared for, because the Bible equips us with that knowledge. Cindy, I saw your hand up. A lot of debate tonight.
It's interesting that Paul is writing this while being held by the Roman soldiers. And he's saying the Romans aren't really your enemy, it's the invisible. And you can have the same power, the same strength, if you gird yourself with God's truth.
Yeah. That's a really good point, and bringing in the context. Paul's in prison. He's imprisoned by Roman soldiers, and he's basically saying these are not our true enemies. The true enemy is the stuff going on that we cannot see, the spiritual fight, the forces of darkness that are coming at our soul. This is what we need to be prepared about. Don't lose focus and think that it's this physical nation that we are at war with. It's something deeper, it's something broader, and it's something far more insidious in many ways. That was a good point, Cindy. Any other comments before we move on to the next point? Dave Rice?
From a symptoms point of view, every night before I turn in, I go around and lock all the doors in the house. And then I usually go around and lock them again. And then sometimes I lay down and get up and check them again. And Paula, of course, thinks I've lost my mind. But I tell her, if they get in the house, we're dead. They can't get in the house. Now, before I used to have some weapons in the house. So at least I wasn't scared because I had something to fall back on. I got rid of those because of grandkids. So somebody comes in, they're getting us. So to me, I look at this from my perspective as kind of an offensive and a defensive position that God has given us. We have to build that armor to protect, but these are pretty vicious beings.
Yeah.
So He gives us some offensive weapons as well.
As an offense and a defense, so that we can be prepared and be ready. It's not all offense, it's not all defense, it's both. And that's an interesting perspective, Dave. If we're not prepared, if we're not checking, if we're not being vigilant, then there's a large risk for us when we are fighting a foe that we don't know when, where, and how. Well, we know how. We don't know when and where, when they're going to strike necessarily, but we know they are. And it's a good point. Justin?
I'll make it quick. We often think of ourselves as purely physical beings, but I mentioned it a while back from the pulpit, but we're souls,
Yep.
right? And we should think of other people as souls. And I appreciate Cindy's comment too, because it's like the Romans weren't the enemies, right? The devil's the enemy, and that's who's called out.
Yeah.
And we're a soul or a spiritual being with a physical shell in the moment.
Yep.
But there's an eternal nature to us too, and that's the battle we're fighting is for souls.
Exactly. And there's, you and I have talked about this before. We as human beings, we have our inner man, we have our mind, we have our physical bodies, and everyone, and this is what sets mankind apart as a creation, is the fact that we are beings that have souls, that have a spiritual component of ourselves that's beyond the physical, and that's a part of us that is most at risk in the fight that we're talking about. To move on here for a second with the time that we have, getting into verse 13, therefore take up the full armor of God so that you will be able to resist in the evil day, and having done everything to stand firm. Now, next week we'll talk more about the pieces of armor, but I want us to think each piece of armor symbolizes an essential part, and Ian made reference to this, an essential part of our defense and our offense against the forces that we are at war with, against the forces of evil. And we have something to combat them in the Word that not only combats them but illuminates them, our faith which defends us, our helmet or the idea of salvation that guards our minds, we have righteousness that guards our hearts, and we have our propelled forward by the gospel. But all of these are something that we first have to choose to take up. In verse 13, this armor is useless if we don't put it on, as we kind of already made reference to. And I'm sure we've heard this, some of you have probably heard this more than once. But what part of the armor is the most important part? Janine?
All of this armor is in the front.
I didn't get you with the trick question. Yeah, exactly. All of the armor. It's not that, we need the sword. That's the most important piece. Or we need the helmet. We need the breastplate. Paul's very clear here. Take up the full armor. All of it is necessary. It was very much a trick question. There isn't an this one piece is more important than the other. All of it is necessary to have a functional defense and to be equipped for battle. If you go into a fight and you don't have your weapon, not going to be very effective. If you go into a fight and you don't have your shield, you're not going to be very effective. You go into a battle without your chest armor, your helmet, or your shoes, you're not going to be very effective. It's all necessary to be an effective combatant on the field. Nita? That's a very good point. We are important in that we have to make the choice to use it and to use it well, or it does nothing for us. And I think that's a good point that shouldn't be overlooked, that we have to make the choice and we ourselves have to wield the armor. God gives and provides for us a way to equip it and provides it for us, but at the end of the day, if we don't pick up the sword, we don't pick up the shield, we don't put on the breastplate and make that choice to do so, it's not going to do any good for us. It's just going to say, well, here's my armory over here, but, I don't really put it on, so it's just, like you said, Nita, it's going to be a hunkless or a useless hunk of metal at the end of the day. Last point that I want to make, and if there are any last comments, is the very end of verse 13. And we sort of talked about this morning, and Blake French also mentioned this in his own lesson a couple of weeks ago. But the really important part in verse 13 is not just to take up the armor to resist, but then to choose to stand firm. We put on the armor, and when we put on the armor, we're making a choice. Whether we realize it or not, if we seek God's protection, we put on the armor, we are making the choice to participate in the battle. We're making the choice to defend ourselves. And if we don't stand firm, if we don't make that choice to stand firm, then there's no point of even putting it on. And I know that's somewhat blunt, but we have to be clear of our intentions. If we're going to follow Christ and we're going to make that choice to walk in a new life, to put on the new self, the other analogy that we saw in chapter 4, to change our way of life, then we have to be willing to stand firm in it when we are pushed back. Because if there's one thing in all of that we've discussed tonight, if there's one thing that I hope everyone takes away, is that there is a fight. Whether you like it or not, there's a fight. And a fight means a struggle. Fight means difficulty. A fight means that there's going to be a winner, there's going to be a loser, and that someone is trying their hardest to be on the winning side and not the losing side. And whether we like it or not, when we make the choice to follow Christ, we have chosen a side in that fight. And if we're not willing and ready and aware that we need to take up that armor and stand firm, then we're not going to be firm. And we're not going to be able to win. All of these ideas that we see with Paul are interconnected. All these ideas that God is showing us through Paul in these chapters are all interconnected. If we make the choice to get in on one side or the other, because even if we reject God, we're making a choice for the other side, whether we realize it or not. Once we choose Christ, we are accepting the fact that we're in a fight. And we're accepting the fact that we're going to be pushed against. And we're accepting the fact that we are going to need help to stand firm, because we can't do it without the armor. It is only when we put on the armor, as we see in verse 13, that we will be able to resist in the evil day, and having done everything, that we can stand firm. Without putting on the armor, without making that choice, without realizing and having the knowledge that we're in a fight, and realizing most importantly that we need God, then we're not going to be able to overcome and stand firm. All of these ideas build on one another and crescendo into the point of put on the armor and stand firm when wearing it. Hope that makes sense. I know that was a little rambly there, but I hope at least those points make sense to you. Nolan?
I was going to say that David tried to put on Saul's armor. It didn't fit him.
Mm-hmm.
He stood firm, and he didn't fear Goliath because God was with him. And all he had was that sling.
Yeah. Well, it's a very good point. All right, at this time, Mitch, would you mind leading us in a closing word of prayer? And we'll be dismissed.
Father, we thank you so much for the opportunity to be here on this first day of the week. Father, to just learn more of your word. We're thankful for the lesson that Robert has brought to us. It brings to mind, Father, the fact that we are in a spiritual battle. And that you equip us, Father, with the elements that allow us to stand firm. But Father, we need to stand firm. It's what we need to do with those elements to use. You've given that to us, Father. We're so thankful. We pray that we would read your word, strengthen our faith, and have that work within us. We take the opportunity to share the gospel with others, to be a positive influence in the world, which there's so much evil in it, to stand out as light and salt in the world. Father, go with us as we dismiss. Thank you so much for all that you do for us. So we pray. Amen.
Amen.